Hi everyone. I want to talk a little bit about this week's module, and which is titled "What is African Philosophy?" So in this module you have a number of things to do. You have some reading to do. You have some things to watch. There's some text within the module itself. And then of course there's a discussion area that I'll ask you to respond to some of what's gone on this week. And so the question, what is African philosophy, is a surprisingly difficult question to deal with. And I think there are some pitfalls to it. And some of those pitfalls you've seen in some of the writing I've had you read already from me earlier, I guess last week's module. I've argued in the past that one of the I guess dead-end kinds of questions that people often engage in is the question of is there an African philosophy? And now notice that's a subtly different question than what is African philosophy. I mean, is there African philosophy presupposes that there might not be, and that it's somebody's responsibility to demonstrate that in fact there is such a thing as African philosophy. And so I've argued in a variety of places that that is a problematic question. It's not an African question, for one thing. It's a question leveled at Africa, usually from a skeptical West, and it amounts to saying, prove to me that there is such a thing as African philosophy. And if you think about it, that would be a really hard question to defend, especially given that quite often we come to the idea of philosophy with a set of presuppositions about what actually it's supposed to be. That's something I had you think about last week, and I hope you remember what we've talked about last week and what you talked about as well in terms of your own presuppositions, background, all of those sorts of things. The reason that stuff is important is that if you start from an assumption of already recognizing what so-called real philosophy is, and then ask, so where can we find such a thing in Africa, you can easily overlook the kinds of activities that have gone on for literally hundreds of years in Africa, thousands of years in some cases, as well as shoehorning some of what is currently happening in Africa into a set of categories that are maybe recognizable from the West, but really ultimately do violence to the thought within Africa itself. So I've asked the question deliberately not as, is there an African philosophy, but rather, what is African philosophy? Perhaps a more neutral question, I don't know, perhaps still with its own problems. I won't say that it doesn't already come with its own assumptions as well, but what it does allow us to do is to start looking at some of the answers that people have given within Africa to that question. All right, and so what I want to do in this introductory video really is mostly focus on the readings that I had you do, think through those a little bit. These videos are not meant as a substitute for doing the reading. I hope you actually do all of the reading for this course. It's there for a reason. What I want to do is think about some of the things that are raised within these, within the readings that I have given you. And the first one that I'll spend probably the least time on is, oops, I think I messed that up. There we go. Let's do it that way. Is the one that I assigned to you from me. And part of the reason I assigned this reading is that it actually gets used a lot in various people's courses, in African philosophy as a kind of first reading or an introductory reading. The other reason I assigned it to you is that you will recognize that some of the things that are raised within this chapter are very closely track the structure of our own course itself. And so this is really meant as a kind of overview. It was originally went into a book called the Edinburgh Edinburgh Companion to 20th Century Philosophy. And in that book, they tried to just break down lots of different areas of philosophy. And at the end of the book, they decided, well, maybe we need to also look at non-Western philosophies. And so there's a chapter on, I think, Chinese philosophy, and there's, about 4 or 5 chapters, and they asked me to do one on African philosophy. And so I try and tackle, the question of where African philosophy stands in relation to other philosophies, but mostly in relation to itself, in relation to those who are, living in Africa, those who have African experience and so forth. And so as you read through this, and I'll skip through some of the first parts of it, what you're going to see is a series of questions. You've seen me talk about this before. The idea that philosophy resides in its questions and its ability to ask good questions. And so the questions include things like, where is Africa, which we are going to look at in this course as well. It's a much more difficult question than it may seem on the surface, and so we're going to pick up some of that next week. We're going to look at who is African, and that gets us into questions around race, questions around identity, a number of other questions of that nature. Is there something like an essence of being African that, we simply have to look hard enough or look in the right place and we're going to be able to find it? Where does African philosophy come from? To what extent must African philosophy engage traditional thought and culture to be truly African? And this is a really important one, and I saw in some of your discussions already, is that many of you are interested in those more traditional sorts of forms of thought. That question of traditional forms of thought really is worth reflecting on for a moment. And there are many, in some cases, quite elaborate and quite subtle forms of thought that we find in ancient Egypt, in Yoruba thought, in Dogon thought, in any number of thought systems that some of which live to this day, some of which are recorded in historical texts, and we're only in some cases just beginning to understand the kinds of things that they're talking about. And so, it's worth thinking a little bit about how we relate to that thought and how Africans might relate to that thought from our vantage point today. Okay. Do we simply unpack that thought and say, well, there it is, there's African philosophy, right? There's a, lovely example of African philosophy. All we have to do is look at the ethical principles or the metaphysical principles or the epistemological principles given to us in these texts, and that's what African philosophy is. Well, we might want to say that. We might also want to ask how that fits into anything we might recognize as African philosophy today. In other words, what is our relationship to history? What is our relationship to the texts of the past? And that's true not only in Africa, but anywhere else too, right? Do those texts have some sort of legislative value for us? Once we recognize that something is African, does that require that Africans follow those standards or principles or whatever they are in order to be truly African? Does that mean that for people elsewhere in the world? Does it mean that for people studying ancient Confucian texts in China, let's say? Does it mean that for us studying the Iliad in the West, and so it's a complex question as to how we relate to the past. One thing is certain, though: these texts are worth studying and understanding. Right? It's not that we can simply set them to the side and say, well, they're old, or well, nobody really reads them today, and therefore they can't be relevant. I think it really is incumbent upon us to understand as well as we can not only what those texts are saying on their surface, but how they were understood by the people who lived with them, how they were taken, how they were, were they taken as descriptions of the universe? Were they taken as one approach among many to how one might live? How about the systems that have divine figures in them, gods, spirits, these sorts of things. What work are those metaphysical entities doing? And are we being asked to believe in them in order for them to have some sort of significance or relevance today? What's interesting, I think, about some of these things is that they don't necessarily require a belief in them in order to see that they're a description of how one might live in the universe and how the universe actually operates. And so I think there is value in studying the Orisha, the traditional Yoruba system of thought. And even apart from the fact that it has come to be passed down in forms like Santeria in Cuba and in other places in the Caribbean, and other kinds of hybridized and other kinds of forms of religious and cosmological thinking. So what I'm trying to say, what all of that is really about, is that I think the philosophical question that we have to ask is how we relate to our past. And that's true not only for those who are, wherever you happen to be, but also for those in Africa, right? I think it's, can be all too easy to say, here we have, an example of a pure African text, unencumbered by colonial influences, unencumbered by, anything from the outside. This must be truly African, right? And if it is truly African, that has some hold, or that has some set of requirements that, people must live by or must take seriously or something like that. I think philosophy is always a self-reflective and self-critical process, no matter where we are. And so I think it has to come into play at that point as well. So we are going to look at some of those sorts of traditional forms. My orientation in this course is to ask questions that will always try and connect whatever we see in the past within Africa, whether those be self-consciously philosophical texts, which we'll see in Ethiopia and in a number of other places, or what we might think of as more cosmological texts, reflections of people on the nature of the universe and their place in it. The question will always be the self-critical question and the self-reflective question. What sense do we make of these things? And what sense might Africans make of these things? Now, here's the caveat, right? Most of us are not African. Some people in this class may well be. I am certainly not. I lay no claim to be able to say, here's what Africans ought to think of these texts. What I can lay claim to is laying the groundwork and laying the field of study for you. But it really comes down to the question of those who, those who live a life within a place have to ask about what are the resources available to construct that life and to live that life. And so that's part of what we're seeing in that question. And if we continue on, we see other questions. How can and does Africa relate to the West, other philosophical, cultural, scientific, and religious traditions, to colonizing countries and to its diaspora? That's a huge question, obviously. There's a great deal written in African philosophy about resisting colonialism, resisting not just colonialism of the past, in which Western nations colonized African countries, but what Ngugi wa Thiong'o called colonizing the mind. He wanted to decolonize the mind. In other words, he was making the claim, I think he's right about this, that those patterns of thought of colonialism take over a way of looking at the world, and he wanted people to get rid of that. You see this in many other figures as well. So the question of how Africa can relate to the fact and the reality of colonialism, slavery, apartheid, all of the horrible, violent things that have happened to it. That's a philosophical question as well as a question for other disciplines as well. Question around reason. We're going to pick this up this term. Is reason culturally specific? There are those who have tried to argue that there's a particular form of reason that is African in some sense, however we're going to define African. And it differs qualitatively from other forms of reason, particularly Western forms of reason. And so we're going to unpack that. I mean, what sense would it make to make that kind of claim? And, is it a plausible claim? Or is there some other way of thinking about how reason itself works? Questions around fundamental reality. This gets us back to some things I was just talking about, those notions of cosmology, the description of the universe and our place in it. And so, we're going to think about fundamental reality, but that's not only cosmology, but it's also things like time, things like causation, metaphysical entities, witches, spirits, ancestors, all of these figures show up within African experience and African philosophy. And so what sense do we make of those? Another question, how can and how should political, social, and ethical life be imagined in Africa? Again, a huge question, a big umbrella sort of thing that we could, have a lot to say about. Whole courses could be taught on this one. So we're going to look at a number of figures that give us a sense of how to approach that. And then finally, what's the relationship between thought and practice in Africa? I mean, sometimes when we think about philosophy in a standard Western philosophy class, we don't maybe give a lot of thought to the idea that philosophy can or should be practical. In Africa, I think it's fair to say a lot more thought is given to that. Like, what difference does it make really if we unpack, if we think about some of the principles and some of the ideas that we can find within texts within Africa, within oral tradition, within a number of other sorts of things. Should the goal of philosophy be to change life for the better? Or should the goal of philosophy simply be to describe the world as it is, to describe human experience? Or should it be something other than those things? So that's that essay. The other readings that I have for you are going to be within the African philosophy reader text. The first one is by Henry Odera Aruka, and his notion of four trends, and I'm going to talk a bit about that in the module as well. This idea that we can kind of give a taxonomy, kind of a structure of different approaches to African philosophy. So that's a brief reading. The second one is by Pauline Huntanji. It's called An Alienated Literature. It's a really interesting argument. Huntanji is a very important figure in the history of African philosophy. We're going to talk about him some more in this term. He's perhaps best known for the idea of what he calls ethno-philosophy, which is not a position that he espouses, but rather one that he argues against. And so in this discussion of what is African philosophy, Huntanji wants to say, well, there are a lot of people who have identified African philosophy closely with traditional folkways, traditional forms of thought. His primary target is somebody we're going to talk about named Placide Tempels, who publishes this book in the 1940s and early 50s called Bantu Philosophy. Now, Tempels was not African. He was a Belgian priest who was working in what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo, in the southern part of that country. And so what he does is to make some claims which is really meant to push back against the prevailing attitude within the Catholic Church and within Western thought that Africans were not capable of having coherent thought, and certainly not capable of having a philosophy. And so Tempels was trying to push back and say, no, they do have that, and we can see that in the structure of language and in some other areas as well. And so, that's in some sense the kind of positive message, that he's trying to deliver. The result, the consequence of writing this is a certain picture of what is going to count as African philosophy. And so for many people, it ends up being a kind of anonymously held, culture-wide or society-wide approach to thought, or to just a kind of view of how the world works, if you wish. And this is mediated through stories and songs and proverbs and oral tradition and all sorts of different things. It's not a critically held view of the world. It's rather simply just how everyone thinks the world works. And so Huntanji wants to criticize that. He wants to basically say that can't be philosophy. It's something else. It's it's folk tradition, it's whatever. But for philosophy, you have to have something that's critical. And by critical, he doesn't mean differing with or something like that. He means the ability to self-reflectively think on the reliability of ideas, right? Do we want to accept an idea or don't we? He says philosophy at its minimum has to have that. It also has to be something attached to individuals. In other words, we have to be able to identify, this person thinks this about that, and this other person thinks something else, and they have a discussion about it, and that's what philosophy looks like, Huntanji says. Now, this launches quite an extensive, I don't know if I'd call it a controversy exactly, but people line up on different sides of this opinion that Huntanji gave us. On the one hand, he is trying to essentially make philosophy into something that does not really draw on traditional content. I mean, he is in fact actually in favor of traditional content, but it has to be turned into philosophy. Some work has to be done. Some critical, reflective work has to be done. So there are those who go along with that, who think, yeah, that's what philosophy is, and let's not pretend that anything else is really philosophy. And then there's lots of others who say, no, if we're going to find philosophy in Africa, we need to take that seriously, and more seriously than just as raw material to turn into something. It needs to be taken seriously as philosophy in and of itself. We need to be able to say there were philosophers in traditional Africa. And so in the article that I gave you of my own, I go through some of the responses to Huntanji that have come up very briefly, one like a sentence each kind of thing. But you can see here Huntanji's argument, and I think it's a really interesting argument. I think whether one agrees with him or not, I think he is raising some important points about how we go about doing philosophy. Like, what does it mean to do philosophy, especially in a place like Africa, which has a lot of what we might think of as cosmological and ethical and traditional and political ideas, but they may not come in the form that are recognizable in the West. Okay, and so what you have in the third article that I gave you there, it's by Lucius Outlaw. It's called African Philosophy, Deconstructive and Reconstructive Challenges. And now Outlaw wrote this in the mid-1980s, 1987. And in the history of philosophy, that was a time when a lot of people were talking about the notion of deconstruction. It was connected to Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher, and so Outlaw is kind of deliberately using that frame. It's a frame that is perhaps less familiar today, or at least the word deconstruction has taken on other kinds of meanings that maybe obscure what he's trying to do here. But what Outlaw's trying to do is basically he's trying to kind of take apart versions of African philosophy that really can't deliver on a true picture of African life. He's trying to, like, in some ways, like Huntanji, although he actually argues quite strongly against Huntanji in places, but like Huntanji, he's trying to say that we have accepted certain things as African philosophy that maybe don't really deserve the name. But then there's this other side, the reconstructive side. Then perhaps that's the most interesting part of what he's trying to do, and I would suggest that you read closely to see what exactly he thinks is reconstructible or reconstructive in African philosophy. It's very clear, and Outlaw is not African, he's African American. He's taught at Vanderbilt, I think, for many years. What he thinks of as reconstructive really is pushing back against the Western assumptions that continue to be held within African philosophy. Colonialist assumptions, and colonialism is not just a political project, it's also an intellectual project, right? Universities in Africa have been modeled after Western universities, not just in the kind of overall structure, but down to the disciplinary level. If you were taking philosophy in an African university for many years, you would basically be taking philosophy very much as you would anywhere else in the world. If it's an Anglophone country, it would look a lot like what you would take in Britain. If it's a Francophone country, you'd probably take a version of philosophy that looks a lot like what you would take in France. And so, Huntamji's argument, I think, is trying to say, look, is that really what we want to do in order to understand African philosophy? Don't we want to reconstruct African philosophy without or at least very much aware of the assumptions that have been brought in through those colonial incursions and colonial violence? And so that's, in part what he's trying to do here. On the way, he's doing a number of other things to try and kind of flesh out what deconstructive and reconstructive philosophy means, and I'm going to get you to talk a bit about that in the discussion area. But that's really the readings that we have for this week, and I hope they kind of give you a framework, a way of thinking about what we're getting into. People often come to African philosophy thinking, oh great, we're going to study the traditional folkways of traditional people. Well, we might talk about those, yes, but is that philosophy, right? Or is it something else? Is what an anthropologist would study the same thing as what a philosopher would study? Within Africa, and I try as much as possible to reflect about, African philosophy as it's taught on the African continent, those things are kept quite separate. What happens in anthropology is often kept quite separate from the kind of thing that happens in philosophy. And so we are going to, as much as possible, be doing African philosophy, and asking the kinds of questions that would be asked, that are asked within African institutions on the continent by African philosophers with their African students, right? And so what we're talking about today is very much the kind of thing that would be discussed. So that's probably enough of an introduction for the readings, at least. And so check out what else is in the module. We have an interview this week. I'm very excited about it. It's really the beginning of an interview series that I'm going to be doing. African Philosophy Conversations, I'm calling it, and the first one is with Dr. Chika Jeffers, and he is the person who is co-scripting the Africana series in History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps, which you're going to be listening to a bunch of those episodes this term. And so I wanted to have him right up front and center to get him to talk a little bit about that series and what he's trying to do with it and all of that kind of thing. So that is this module's video, and I hope you enjoy it.